Mountain man paid $2 for a disabled girl, marries her when she says his name. That's the tale riding through Bitter Creek like a dust storm. Folks think they know what happened, but they didn't see the look in her eyes, or what she said when the silence finally broke. Out past the ridge where lawmen don't bother and winter holds its breath, something stirred between a forgotten girl and the man who refused to leave her behind. But when townfolk come calling, with papers, questions, and judgment, what's spoken in the quiet may change everything. What did she say? And why did it make a mountain man lay down everything he knew? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The autumn sun hung low over Bitter Creek as Boaz Maddox guided his wagon down the rutted main street. Stacked neat and high in the wagon bed, his winter's work of cured elk hides and beaver pelts shifted with each bump and turn. The leather smell mixed with wood smoke from the town's chimneys, bringing memories of lonely nights in his cabin. He pulled his team to a halt outside Watson's general store, his boots raising small puffs of dust as he stepped down. Before he could untie the first bundle, shouts from the auction yard caught his attention. A crowd had gathered at the edge of town, their muttering carrying on the crisp afternoon air. 2 bits, surely someone will give 2 bits for this one? A trader's voice rang out, sharp with frustration. Strong back, despite the curve, silent, won't talk back. Boaz's jaw tightened as he walked closer. Through gaps in the crowd, he saw a girl huddled in a trader's cart. Her shoulders were twisted, her head bowed. But there was something in how she held herself, a quiet dignity that struck him deep. Reverend Mills stood at the edge of the group, his eyes fixed on his boot tips. Sheriff Tucker leaned against a hitching post, picking his teeth with a splinter. "Ain't our concern," the sheriff muttered when he caught Boaz's eye. "Trader's got a right to sell what he owns." The girl lifted her head then, and Boaz saw she wasn't much more than 18. Her eyes met his, clear and unflinching. Though her body was bent, there was no weakness in that gaze. It reminded him of something from long ago. His Lakota mother's words about seeing beyond the surface of things. "Last chance," the trader bellowed. "Won't even feed herself proper, this one. Useless mouth to feed." Boaz felt the weight of his winter's earnings in his pocket. $2 silver, earned through months of solitude and hard work. He'd planned to use them for seed come spring. Without a word, he stepped forward. The crowd parted, whispers following in his wake. He pulled the coins from his pocket, laid them in the trader's outstretched palm. The man's eyes widened. It was far more than he'd hoped to get. Moving slowly, carefully, Boaz approached the cart. The girl watched him, her face unreadable. He reached out, telegraphing his movements like he would with a spooked horse. "May I?" he asked softly. She gave a slight nod. Boaz slipped one arm behind her shoulders, the other under her knees. He lifted her as gently as he could, cradling her slight weight against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, too light for someone her age. The townsfolk stood silent as he carried her to his wagon. Some looked away, shame evident in their stance. Others watched with confusion, unable to understand why the solitary trapper would burden himself this way. Boaz settled her on the wagon seat, tucking his spare blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill. Without acknowledging the staring crowd, he climbed up beside her and clicked to his team. They made camp that night just outside town, where the creek bent through a stand of cottonwoods. Boaz built a small fire, hanging his bean pot over the flames. The girl watched his every move, but made no sound. When the beans were ready, he filled 2 tin cups. He handed one to her, along with a thick slice of cornbread. "Eat what you can," he said quietly. "No rush." She took the food with trembling hands, but her movements were precise. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone who knew the value of every morsel. Boaz focused on his own meal, giving her space. As the stars emerged above them, he heard it, soft and low, barely louder than the creek's murmur. A melody hummed in a clear, sweet tone. He didn't recognize the tune, but something in it spoke of loneliness, of years spent unheard. He added another log to the fire, watching as sparks rose to join the stars. The humming gradually faded as sleep overtook her. Boaz spread his bedroll on the far side of the fire, giving her plenty of space. "Rest easy," he murmured, though she was already asleep. "You're safe now." The night settled around them, cricket song mixing with the gentle breathing of his horses. Boaz stayed awake a while longer, watching the fires dance, wondering what path lay ahead. But for now, this moment was enough. Two souls finding shelter in the vast frontier night. The morning sun cast long shadows across their camp as Boaz packed the wagon for the journey home. He worked methodically, checking each strap and tie, while Rosie sat wrapped in the blanket near the dying embers of their fire. The air held autumn's crispness, promising colder days ahead. 4 days to reach the homestead, Boaz said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Road gets narrow through the mountains, but the team knows the way. He glanced at Rosie, noting how she tracked his movements with watchful eyes. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm as they followed the winding trail toward Elk River Ridge. Boaz kept one eye on the road and one on his quiet companion, making sure she was steady on the wooden seat beside him. "See those scratches on that aspen?" He pointed to a tree as they passed, bare marking his territory, probably the big brown one I've seen fishing the rapids. Rosie leaned forward slightly, studying the deep gouges in the pale bark. Her fingers tapped softly against her knee, matching the cadence of his words. Throughout that first day, Boaz named the things they passed: stands of lodgepole pine stretching tall and straight, the distinctive tracks of elk in muddy patches, hawks circling overhead. He wasn't used to speaking so much, but something about her attentive silence made it feel natural. The second day brought them deeper into the canyon lands. The wagon descended slowly between towering walls of red rock, the trail switching back and forth as it followed the ancient riverbed. The air grew cooler in the shadows of the cliffs. That's when he heard it, a soft humming, formless but clear, rising from beside him. Rosie's eyes were fixed on the canyon walls, her slight frame swaying gently with the wagon's motion as she hummed. The sound wove itself between the clip-clop of hooves and the creak of leather harness. Boaz kept his eyes on the trail, but his heart tightened in his chest. He'd known silence himself after his parents died, before the Lakota family took him in. He remembered how long it had taken for words to feel right again. The afternoon brought storm clouds rolling over the canyon rim. The temperature dropped sharply as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Boaz pulled the wagon under a broad overhang of rock and helped Rosie down. "Storm's coming in hard," he said, checking the sky. "We'll need to shelter in the wagon tonight. Cold snap like this can turn dangerous quick." He spread the elk hides in the wagon bed, creating a nest of sorts among the remaining pelts and trade goods. The rain turned to sleet as darkness fell. Even under the overhang, the wind carried an icy bite. "Up you go," Boaz said, helping Rosie climb into the wagon bed. He arranged the hides around her before climbing in himself, keeping to the far side of the space. The pelts and hides trapped their warmth, and soon the drumming of sleet on the wagon canvas created a cozy rhythm. The third day dawned clear and cold. They climbed out of the canyon lands into forests of spruce and fir. Boaz pointed out the springs he used for water, the meadows where he set his traps, the game trails he followed in hunting season. Rosie's fingers tapped steadily now, keeping time with his stories. On the fourth day, as the sun began its westward slide, they crested a final ridge. Below them lay a small valley, sheltered by mountains on three sides. Smoke rose from a stone chimney set in a sturdy log cabin. A split-rail fence enclosed a chicken run where brown hens scratched in the dirt. To one side stood a well-built smokehouse, and beyond that, a barn where Boaz's mule dozed in the afternoon light. "Home," Boaz said simply. He felt movement beside him and turned to find Rosie smiling. A small thing, barely there, but real. It transformed her face, softening the wariness that had lived in her eyes since the auction yard. The wagon rolled down the last stretch of road as evening approached. Boaz pulled up before the cabin's front door and set the brake. He turned to Rosie, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now, girl." The words hung in the autumn air between them, weighted with promise. Above the valley, the first stars of evening began to shine. The cabin's interior welcomed them with the lingering scent of pine smoke and dried herbs. Boaz lit the oil lamp, its warm glow revealing a simple but orderly home. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while rough-hewn shelves held tools and supplies. His own bed, covered in wool blankets, sat in one corner. "This corner will be yours," he said, gesturing to a space near the warmth of the hearth. An old straw cot leaned against the wall. Boaz dragged it into position, then disappeared into the storage room. He returned with extra blankets and a worn quilt. "It ain't much," he admitted, arranging the bedding to cushion the thin mattress. "But it'll keep you warm enough." In the lamp's light, he noticed Rosie favoring her left side. Without comment, he retrieved a sturdy walking stick from beside the door. Using his knife, he worked through the evening, carefully shaping the wood. He added a padded crosspiece near the top and wrapped it in soft leather. When finished, he handed her the modified cane. "Should help with balance," he said simply. The next morning, Boaz showed her the daily routines. He demonstrated how to rinse vegetables in the basin, pointing out which ones needed extra care. Near the hearth, he showed her how to fold the cured hides, explaining which ones would become trading goods. "Just do what you can," he told her. "No rush on any of it." Rosie watched intently as Boaz went about his tasks. He whittled new tool handles at the table, his hands moving with practiced ease. Outside, she observed him feeding the chickens, noting how even these simple creatures trusted his gentle approach. That evening, as beans simmered in the pot, Boaz spoke more than he had since their arrival. He told her of winters spent in the high pass, of storms that could trap a man for days. "Learned about survival from the Sioux," he said, stirring the fire. "Lost my folks when I was young. Lakota family took me in during the worst winter I'd ever seen." His voice grew distant with memory. "Their ways saved my life. Taught me about honor, too, about seeing people true." Rosie sat close to the fire, a piece of charred kindling in her hand. As Boaz spoke, she drew on its smooth surface, forming careful letters. When she finished, she held it out to him. The next morning, while Boaz checked his traps, Rosie found an old slate among his supplies. She cleaned it carefully and waited for his return. When he came in from the cold, she pressed it into his rough hands. The slate bore 3 simple words: "You have kind hands." Boaz stared at the writing for a long moment. Something warm and unfamiliar spread through his chest, like a coal catching fire. He set the slate down without speaking, but his movements were gentler than usual as he hung up his coat. Days flowed into a steady rhythm. Boaz worked his trap lines while Rosie tended to the cabin. She gained confidence with her tasks, finding ways to work around her limitations. The crutch helped her move more freely, and she developed her own system for managing the daily chores. One evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold, Boaz returned from checking his traps. The cabin door opened to unexpected warmth and the smell of cooking. Rosie stood at the hearth, stirring a pot of cornmeal mash. She had set the table with 2 tin plates and spoons, a flickering candle between them. The mash was simple fare, but she'd added wild onions and herbs from his stored supplies. Boaz sat down, something tight in his throat as he watched her ladle the food onto his plate. He ate every bite, the simple meal tasting better than any he could remember. Across the table, Rosie's eyes held a quiet pride. The slate lay nearby, ready for whatever words might come next. A month of mountain autumn had painted the aspens gold when Boaz hitched the wagon for their first trip to Bitter Creek. The morning air held winter's promise as they set out, Rosie wrapped in a borrowed wool coat that hung loose on her thin frame. "Won't take more than a few hours," Boaz said, clicking to the horses. "Need supplies before the passes get dicey." Rosie nodded, clutching her slate close. She'd grown steadier these past weeks, finding her place in the cabin's routines. But as the town's first buildings came into view, she pressed closer to Boaz's side. Main Street stirred with mid-morning activity. Wagon wheels creaked over packed dirt, and the general store's bell chimed as customers came and went. Heads turned as Boaz helped Rosie down from the wagon. Whispers followed them like shadows. "That's the girl from the auction yard. Living up there with that trapper more. Ain't natural is what I say." Boaz kept Rosie close as they made their way toward the mercantile. Before they reached it, widow Nora Talbot stepped into their path. Her black dress and severe expression matched her reputation as the town's self-appointed moral guardian. "Well now," she said, eyes fixed on Rosie. "I see you've recovered some strength, girl." She tapped her walking stick against the boardwalk. "Tell me, are you able to do housework? I've been looking for help with my linens." Rosie shrank behind Boaz's coat. He shifted, placing himself more firmly between them. "She ain't for hire, Mrs. Talbot," he said flatly. The widow's lips pinched tight. "Really, Mr. Maddox, a young woman needs proper guidance. The Ladies' Relief Society has concerns." "Much obliged for your concern," Boaz cut in. "We'll be moving along now." They continued past the widow, Boaz's hand steady at Rosie's elbow. The feed store's open door released the smell of grain and leather into the street. As they approached, Deputy Ezra Hodge stepped out, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Hold up there, Maddox," the deputy called. His badge caught the morning sun. "Been meaning to have words with you." Boaz stopped, keeping Rosie behind him. "Something wrong, Deputy?" Hodge's eyes narrowed. "You took in that girl? That wasn't a livestock auction, you know. Might be some questions about the legality." "Paid to free her, not own her," Boaz interrupted. His voice stayed level, but his shoulders tensed. "She's her own person now." The deputy frowned, shifting his weight. "That's so? And what exactly are your intentions?" "My intention," Boaz said carefully, "is to get our supplies and head home." He met Hodge's gaze steadily. "Unless there's a law against kindness I ain't heard of?" The deputy held his look for a long moment before stepping aside. "Just mind yourself, Maddox. Town's watching." They finished their shopping quickly after that. Rosie's hand trembled slightly as she helped load supplies, but her chin stayed high. The wagon wheels seemed to spin faster on the return journey, as if eager to leave town behind. That evening, with the cabin glowing against mountain darkness, Boaz decided it was time Rosie learned to manage the wood stove. He showed her how to layer the kindling, explaining the importance of proper airflow. "See here," he demonstrated, adjusting the damper. "Too much smoke means, ouch!" He jerked his thumb back from the hot metal, shaking it in the air. A strange sound made him look up. Rosie's shoulders shook with silent laughter, her eyes bright with mischief. She pointed at his reddened thumb, then mimed his reaction with exaggerated gestures. Boaz felt an unfamiliar twitch at the corners of his mouth. Before he knew it, a low chuckle escaped him. Rosie's silent giggles doubled, and soon they were both laughing, his deep rumble mixing with her soundless mirth. The stove lesson continued, punctuated by shared glances and suppressed smiles. When Rosie successfully lit her first fire, pride shone in her eyes. She wrote on her slate, "Now I can warm your supper proper." Boaz nodded, still nursing his thumb. "Reckon you can at that?" He paused, then added softly, "Reckon you already have." The mountain dawn painted the sky in watercolor hues when hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Boaz was already awake, checking his trap lines near the cabin when the rider appeared, a young deputy with papers clutched in his gloved hand. "Mr. Maddox," the deputy called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Got business from town." He dismounted, boots crunching on frost-covered grass. Boaz straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. The morning air grew heavier as the deputy pulled an official-looking document from his saddlebag. "Court summons," the young man said, extending the paper. "Magistrate wants you in Bitter Creek. Matter of unlawful guardianship." Boaz's weathered face hardened as he read. The formal language couldn't mask the truth. Nora Talbot and her Ladies' Relief Society had been busy. They'd filled the town's ears with whispers about propriety and moral danger, demanding Rosie be properly placed under their authority. The cabin door creaked open. Rosie stood in the doorway, her slate clutched to her chest. She'd heard the rider approach. 3 days to appear, the deputy added, already backing toward his horse. Mrs. Talbot's mighty concerned about the girl's welfare. "Reckon she is," Boaz said quietly. his voice like gravel. The deputy mounted up and rode off, leaving the summons crumpled in Boaz's grip. Inside the cabin, Rosie's hands trembled as she packed her few belongings: the modified cane, 2 dresses they'd bought in town, a hair ribbon. Boaz watched from the doorway, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Ain't right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Ain't their business who stays where." Rosie paused in her packing, chalk scratching against her slate. She held it up. "Will they make me go?" Boaz's jaw clenched. "Law says we got to answer the summons. Don't say nothing about after." He stepped closer, voice softening. "But it's your choice, Rosie. Always has been." They set out the next morning, frost giving way to autumn sunshine. The wagon creaked along familiar mountain trails, but the journey felt different from their supply runs. Heavier. Each mile toward town seemed to wind Rosie tighter, her shoulders hunching against some invisible weight. That evening, they made camp in a sheltered grove. Boaz built a small fire while Rosie laid out their bedrolls. The flames cast dancing shadows as they shared a simple supper of jerky and hard biscuits. Neither touched much of it. The second night's camp found them closer to town, the mountains giving way to rolling foothills. Coyotes called in the distance as Boaz added wood to their fire. Rosie sat wrapped in a blanket, her slate resting in her lap. "Listen here," Boaz said suddenly, breaking the evening quiet. "Been thinking on what to say to that magistrate." He poked at the fire, sparks rising like fireflies. "Ain't letting them take you away. Not unless it's what you want." Rosie's chalk moved across her slate, deliberate and sure. She turned it toward the firelight. "You don't own me." Boaz nodded slowly. "No, I don't. Never meant to." She wiped the slate clean, wrote again. "But I want to stay." The simple words hung in the air between them, honest as the stars overhead. Boaz felt something tight in his chest loosen. "That's all I need to know," he said softly. Rosie's smile, small but certain, glowed warmer than the fire. She added more words to her slate. "We'll tell them together?" "Together," Boaz agreed. He reached across the space between them, his calloused hand covering her smaller one for just a moment. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow's like to be a long day." They settled into their bedrolls, the fire burning low. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnesses to a choice made freely, a rescued soul choosing to stay, and a lonely man learning to let someone choose him. The mission house stood at the edge of Bitter Creek, its weathered white boards glowing in the late afternoon sun. Reverend Reuben Halley met them at the gate, his kind eyes crinkling with recognition as Boaz climbed down from the wagon. "Young Maddox," the preacher said warmly. "Been many years since you sat in my Sunday school." He helped Rosie down from the wagon, noting her twisted spine with gentle understanding. "Welcome, child. We've fresh bread and a warm hearth inside." The mission house smelled of pine soap and wood smoke. Reuben showed them to separate rooms, Rosie upstairs in the former nursery, Boaz in the study below. "Times haven't changed much," Reuben said softly to Boaz. "Still helping lost lambs find their way." Early the next morning, while Boaz went to meet the magistrate, Rosie stayed behind to help clean the chapel. Her hands moved steadily over the wooden pews with a cloth, working alongside Reuben as sunlight streamed through the high windows. At the courthouse, Boaz stood before Magistrate Harrison Wells, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and cold eyes. The judge shuffled through papers, lips pressed into a tight line. "Mr. Maddox," Wells began, "this is highly irregular. The girl must testify verbally that she hasn't been coerced. Without her direct statement, we cannot proceed." "Sir," Boaz's voice was rough with frustration, "she don't speak. Haven't since before I found her. Cannot or will not." The magistrate peered over his glasses. "This court requires verbal testimony. The hearing is set for 5 days hence. Either she speaks, or the Ladies' Relief Society's petition will likely be granted." Boaz's hands clenched at his sides. "She writes, communicates clear as day with a slate." "Inadmissible," Wells replied flatly. "Return in 5 days. The girl must speak, or the court will decide her fate without her input. That evening, in the mission house kitchen, Reuben found Boaz staring into the fireplace, his face carved with worry. Rosie had gone up to bed, her slate tucked under her arm. "I remember when you first came to town," Reuben said, settling into a chair. "After the Sioux brought you down from the highlands. You didn't speak for months." Boaz looked up sharply. "Different times." "Maybe not so different." Reuben leaned forward. "You found your voice again because someone took the time, showed patience." He paused. "Perhaps it's time to help her try." "Ain't right to force her," Boaz growled. "Not force," Reuben corrected gently. "Invite. Give her the chance to choose." The next morning, Boaz found Rosie in the chapel garden. Sunlight filtered through the changing leaves as he sat beside her on a rough wooden bench. "Got something to ask you," he said quietly. Rosie tilted her head, listening. "Reckon you might want to try speaking again. Just simple sounds at first." He watched her face carefully. "Don't have to. Your choice entirely." Rosie's hands trembled slightly as she wrote on her slate. "Scared." "No, you are. I'll be right here." They started with the simplest sounds. "Sun," Boaz said, pointing upward. Rosie's lips moved silently, shaping the word. "Bread," he tried next, touching the morning loaf on the bench between them. Her throat worked, but no sound came. Frustration clouded her eyes. "Here's an easy one," Boaz said softly. "Bo, just like it sounds." Rosie's lips trembled. A whisper of breath escaped, almost like a word, but not quite. Tears welled in her eyes. "That's enough for now," Boaz said quickly. "Don't have to." Rosie's chalk scratched against her slate, determined. "I want to." Boaz read the words, feeling something catch in his throat. He nodded slowly, understanding the courage it took to face this fear. "Then we'll keep trying. Together." The autumn breeze rustled through the chapel garden as they sat there, a man and a girl, sharing the weight of silence and the hope of breaking it. Above them, sparrows called from the eaves, their simple songs filling the morning air with possibility. The autumn days slipped by like fallen leaves in a stream. Each morning, before the sun could warm the frost-kissed grass, Boaz and Rosie made their way behind the whitewashed chapel. There, in the quiet sanctuary of Reverend Reuben's garden, they practiced. Boaz kept his voice gentle, patient as spring rain. "Water," he would say, dipping his fingers in the rain barrel. "Sky," pointing upward to the dawn-painted clouds. Rosie's lips would move, shaping the words in silence, her eyes fixed on his face with determination. Reuben brought them worn hymnals, their pages soft with years of faithful hands. "Music often finds its way when words cannot," he said, showing Rosie the familiar verses. Her fingers traced the notes like old friends. In the afternoons, while Boaz helped Reuben repair loose shingles or split wood for winter, Rosie would sit in the garden with her hymnal. "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing" became her favorite. The melody flowed from her in clear, sweet humming that drifted up to where the men worked. "She's finding her way," Reuben observed one afternoon, watching Rosie tend the late-season vegetables, like a bird testing its wings. Boaz nodded, his throat tight. Ain't never heard anything sweeter than her humming. The morning air was crisp with coming winter when everything changed. Boaz had gone to check on his wagon team, leaving Rosie to gather eggs from the mission's small hen house. The sun had just cleared the eastern hills when he heard it, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. "Bo?" He froze, one hand on the barn door. The word hung in the air like morning mist, barely there, but unmistakable. Turning slowly, he saw Rosie standing by the hen house, her egg basket forgotten at her feet. Her eyes were wide with wonder and fear. "Say it again," he whispered, hardly daring to breathe. His heart hammered against his ribs like a wild thing. Rosie's lips trembled, then, clear as a bell on Sunday morning, "Boaz." His name and her voice broke something loose inside him. Tears sprang to his eyes as he crossed the yard in 3 long strides. Rosie's own eyes brimmed as he knelt beside her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She buried her face in his coat, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "You did it, girl," he murmured into her hair. "You found your voice." They stayed that way for a long moment, while morning light painted the world in gold and the chickens clucked softly around their feet. When they finally pulled apart, Rosie's face shone with joy and tears. That evening, after Rosie had gone up to bed, Boaz found Reuben in his study. The preacher sat in his old leather chair, reading by lamplight. He looked up as Boaz entered, noting the man's troubled expression. "Something on your mind, son?" Boaz paced the worn carpet, his hands working at his sides. Finally, he stopped. "What if—" he began, then faltered, starting again. "What if I offered her my name?" Reuben set his book aside, studying Boaz carefully. "Marriage, you mean?" "Would protect her for life." Boaz's voice was rough with emotion. "No more courts, no more ladies' relief society trying to claim her." "You know it would stir scandal," Reuben warned gently. "Folk would talk. Say you took advantage." "Don't care what they say." Boaz's jaw set stubbornly. "Care about keeping her safe." "And your heart?" Reuben asked softly. "What does it say?" Boaz looked out the study window where stars were beginning to pierce the evening sky. "Says I can't imagine my life without her now. Says maybe God sent her to heal something in me, same as I helped heal something in her." Reuben nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Then perhaps it's not just protection you're offering, but a true home. For both of you." The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the moment. Outside, a whip-poor-will called into the gathering night, its lonely song a reminder of how far they'd all come from where they started. The Bitter Creek Courthouse stood solemn in the crisp morning air, its wooden benches packed with townsfolk eager to witness the hearing. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Nora Talbot sat primly in the front row, surrounded by ladies from the Relief Society, their faces stern with righteous purpose. Boaz's boots echoed against the floor as he entered with Rosie. She walked carefully beside him, her steps measured but steady. The whispers that had filled the room died away, leaving only the slow tick of the wall clock and the rustle of starched skirts. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Miss Quinn," he addressed Rosie directly, "you'll need to step forward and speak for yourself in this matter." Rosie's fingers tightened on her slate, her knuckles white with tension. Boaz touched her elbow gently. "I'll stand with you," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. She nodded, and together they approached the judge's desk. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, marking each step like a heartbeat. "Miss Quinn," the judge continued, "this court needs to hear from your own lips whether you're being held against your will. Do you understand?" Rosie's chest rose and fell with trembling breaths. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, soft but clear as morning light, her voice filled the room. "Boaz never hurt me." She paused, gathering strength. "He's kind. He gave me my name." A collective gasp rippled through the courthouse. Several women clutched their throats in surprise. Even the judge blinked rapidly, his pen frozen above his ledger. Nora Talbot shot to her feet, her face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this proves nothing. The girl is clearly simple-minded, easily led." "Then let me offer her a new name." Boaz's voice cut through the growing murmurs. He turned to face the court, his shoulders square and proud, as husband and wife. The courthouse erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Women fanned themselves vigorously. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against his desk, restoring order. Rosie stared up at Boaz, her eyes wide with wonder. He met her gaze steadily. Years of loneliness and hope laid bare in that single look. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Reverend Reuben rose from his place near the back of the room. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of his office. I'll marry them today if she agrees." All eyes turned to Rosie. She stood straighter, her voice stronger now. "Yes." Judge Harrison removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief as he considered the scene before him. "This is unusual," he said finally. "Miss Quinn appears to be of sound mind, but given the circumstances, I must insist on proper procedure." He replaced his glasses, looking sternly over their rims. "The marriage will be delayed until Miss Quinn can be evaluated by Dr. Matthews. If he finds her competent to make this decision, the ceremony may proceed on Sunday." Nora Talbot's face darkened like a thundercloud. "Your Honor, I must protest. This is completely improper." "Mrs. Talbot," the judge cut her off firmly, "the court has made its decision. Miss Quinn will stay at the mission house under Reverend Rubin's supervision until Sunday." His gavel struck once more. "This hearing is concluded." As the crowd began to disperse, Boaz and Rosie remained standing before the judge's desk. She reached for Boaz's hand, twining her fingers with his. The touch was simple, but it held all the promise of spring after a long winter. "Thank you," she whispered. And though the words were meant for Boaz, they seemed to fill the entire courthouse with their quiet grace. The morning light streamed through the windows, painting golden paths across the floor. Outside, life in Bitter Creek continued its steady pace. Horses stamped in their hitches, shopkeepers swept their boardwalks, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. But inside the courthouse, something profound had shifted, like the first thaw of spring breaking winter's hold on the land. The days following the hearing brought an unusual energy to Bitter Creek. Sunlight seemed brighter, the air fresher, as if the whole town had awakened from a long slumber. Outside the general store, women gathered in clusters, their voices rising and falling like wind through prairie grass. Inside the saloon, men debated the strange turn of events over tin cups of coffee. "Madness pure and simple," declared old Tom Weber, shaking his head over his morning brew. But Sarah Miller, the baker's wife, saw it differently. "He saved that girl," she whispered to her friends as they selected fabric at Henderson's Dry Goods. "And now she's saved him right back." At the mission house, Reverend Rubin's wife Martha transformed their spare room into a makeshift bridal chamber. She helped Rosie try on a simple cream-colored dress, its collar trimmed with delicate lace from her own hope chest. The fabric settled softly around Rosie's shoulders, masking their irregular slope. "There now," Martha said, adjusting the hem. "You look absolutely radiant." Rosie caught her reflection in the clouded mirror. Her cheeks glowed pink, her eyes bright with joy. She touched the dress reverently, then wrote on her slate, "It's perfect." Boaz, meanwhile, spent his days preparing the cabin for their return. He added curtains to the windows, built a proper washstand, and carved a new bed frame from sturdy oak. Each evening, he visited Rosie at the mission house, sharing quiet moments on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains. But storm clouds gathered on their horizon in the form of Nora Talbot. On Thursday afternoon, while Martha was occupied with church duties, Nora slipped into the mission house. She found Rosie alone, arranging wildflowers in a tin can. "My dear," Nora's voice dripped with false sweetness, "I've been so concerned about you." Rosie stiffened but nodded politely. "You must know what people are saying," Nora continued, settling uninvited into a chair. "That he's only marrying you out of pity. A man like that, taking in a..." She paused deliberately. "Disadvantaged girl. It's Christian charity, nothing more." Rosie's hands trembled as she reached for her slate, but Nora wasn't finished. "He'll grow tired of caring for you. Men need strong wives who can work alongside them, bear healthy children. You'll be such a burden." Nora's words fell like ice into the warm afternoon. "If you truly care for him, you'll let him find someone whole." When Martha returned, she found Rosie alone, the wildflowers scattered across the floor. That evening, when Boaz came to visit, Rosie kept her eyes down, her slate blank and cold in her lap. His attempts at conversation met only silence. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with approaching rain. Martha discovered Rosie's bed empty, the cream dress folded carefully on the quilt. A single piece of paper lay on the pillow, written in Rosie's careful hand. He deserves someone whole. Boaz arrived for his usual morning visit just as Martha found the note. His weathered face went pale as he read the words. Without speaking, he turned and strode to the livery stable, his spurs ringing against the wooden boardwalk. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he saddled his bay horse. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a tide, bringing with them the sharp scent of coming rain. Reverend Reuben hurried across the street. "Boaz, wait! There's a storm coming in." "Then I'd best ride fast," Boaz replied, swinging into the saddle. His voice was calm, but his eyes held a desperate intensity. "Where will you look?" "The hills." Boaz gathered the reins. "There's an old trapper's shelter up by Eagle Creek. She's seen me mend my gear there." He turned his horse toward the mountain trail. "She knows the way." The first heavy drops began to fall as horse and rider disappeared into the gathering gloom. Behind them, the town held its breath, waiting to see what the storm would bring. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the rugged path ahead. Boaz rode steadily upward, his heart beating in time with his horse's hooves. The rain fell harder now, but he barely noticed. His mind was filled with images of Rosie, her gentle smile, her quiet strength, the way her eyes lit up when she finally spoke his name. "She thinks I deserve better," he muttered into the wind. "She doesn't understand. She's the best thing that's ever happened to me." The storm clouds churned overhead, promising worse to come. But Boaz pressed on, following the steep trail into the hills. He had found Rosie once before. He would find her again. The storm unleashed its fury across the mountains, but Boaz pressed on through sheets of rain. His horse picked its way carefully along muddy trails as thunder cracked overhead. Water streamed from the brim of his hat, but his eyes never stopped scanning the landscape, searching for any sign of Rosie. The bay horse struggled up a steep canyon wall, hooves sliding on slick stone. Boaz leaned forward in the saddle, speaking soft encouragements. "Easy now, steady." Lightning flashed, illuminating the twisted pines and jagged rocks around them. In that brief, brilliant moment, something caught his eye, a splash of color against dark bark. Dismounting quickly, Boaz approached the thorny branch. There, caught in the twigs, was a familiar thread of blue wool. His fingers trembled slightly as he carefully untangled it from the thorns. It was from Rosie's shawl, the one Martha had given her. Hope surged in his chest. "She came this way," he murmured, leading his horse forward. The rain had softened the ground, and now he could make out faint impressions in the mud, small boot prints heading deeper into the canyon. For hours he followed her trail through the wilderness. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and darkness was beginning to creep in beneath the heavy clouds. Worry gnawed at him as he imagined Rosie out here alone, cold and exhausted, his jaw clenched tight against the fear. The creek came into view just as dusk was settling over the mountains. Swollen with rain, it churned angrily between its banks. Boaz's heart nearly stopped when he spotted a crumpled form beside the water. "Rosie!" He vaulted from the saddle, boots splashing through puddles as he ran to her side. She lay unconscious, her dress and shawl soaked through, her skin pale and cold to the touch. But when he pressed trembling fingers to her neck, he found a pulse, weak but steady. "Hold on, girl," he whispered, gathering her gently in his arms. Her head lolled against his chest as he lifted her. "I've got you now." The ranger's cabin wasn't far, a simple one-room shelter they'd used before when storms caught them in the high country. Boaz carried Rosie through the deepening gloom, his horse following behind. The cabin's door creaked open at his touch, revealing the familiar space with its stone fireplace and rough-hewn walls. Working quickly, Boaz laid Rosie on a bed of pine boughs near the hearth. His hands shook as he struck flint to steel, coaxing flames from dry kindling stored in the corner. Soon, a warm fire crackled in the fireplace, pushing back the darkness and chill. He found blankets in the storage chest, rough wool but dry and clean. With gentle care, he wrapped Rosie in layers of warmth, arranging her closer to the fire's heat. Her breathing was shallow but regular, and some color had begun returning to her cheeks. Through the long night, Boaz kept vigil, He held her small hand between his calloused ones, warming her fingers as he watched the steady rise and fall of her chest. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin was quiet except for the pop and crackle of burning wood. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Rosie stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as she took in her surroundings. She tried to sit up, but weakness made her sink back against the blankets. "Why'd you come?" she rasped, her voice rough from cold and disuse. Boaz squeezed her hand gently, his heart too full for fancy words. "You're the only thing I've ever gone back for," he whispered. Tears welled in Rosie's eyes. She turned her face away, but Boaz caught her chin with gentle fingers, making her meet his gaze. "Listen to me," he said softly. "I ain't looking for someone whole. I'm looking for you, just you, exactly as you are." A tear slipped down Rosie's cheek. "But I can't." "You can do more than you know," Boaz interrupted. "You brought music back to my quiet. You made my house feel like home." He brushed the tear away with his thumb. "Don't let anyone tell you you're not enough. You're everything I never knew I needed." Rosie's fingers tightened around his as more tears fell, but now a smile trembled at the corners of her mouth. "You came after me," she whispered. "Always will," he replied simply. "That's what love means." The storm settled into a steady drumbeat on the cabin's roof. Inside, warmth from the fire wrapped around them like a blanket. Boaz stirred a pot of dried beans and salt pork he'd found in the cabin's stores, adding pine needles for tea. The familiar scent of cooking food filled the small space. Rosie sat propped against the wall, wrapped in wool blankets watching the flames dance. Color had returned to her cheeks, but shadows still lingered in her eyes. Boaz ladled the hot stew into tin cups and handed one to her. "Eat," he said gently. "You need your strength." She took small, careful bites while Boaz settled beside her. Thunder rolled in the distance, but its fury had passed. Rain pattered against the windows, creating a peaceful rhythm in the quiet. "My Sioux mother," Boaz began slowly, his voice soft in the firelight. "She taught me about strength. Not the kind that comes from fists or guns, but the kind that grows in secret." He paused, stirring his stew. "She showed me a bent pine once growing sideways out of a cliff. See how it reaches?" she said. "Bent trees reach for sun just the same." Rosie's hand stilled around her cup. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the tenderness beneath his weathered exterior. "Your Sioux mother," she whispered, her voice growing stronger. "Tell me more." Boaz's eyes grew distant with memory. "She found me half frozen in the snow when I was just a boy. My folks' wagon had broken down in a blizzard. She carried me to her lodge, nursed me back to health." He smiled faintly. "Taught me that family ain't always about blood." Rosie set her cup down, fingers twisting in her lap. "I never had that," she said quietly. "A real family was passed around like unwanted cargo, too crooked to work properly, too quiet to be worth keeping." Her voice caught. "Everyone saw me as broken." Boaz reached over, covering her nervous hands with his large, calloused one. "You ain't broken, Rosie. You're like that bent pine, growing strong despite everything trying to hold you down." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "How can you say that?" "Look at me, Boaz. I can barely walk straight. Couldn't even speak until you found your voice," he finished firmly. "That takes more courage than most folks will ever know." His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I've watched you face down shame and spite with your head high, seen you learn and grow despite every reason to give up." He squeezed her hands gently. "You've got more strength in your little finger than most folks have in their whole body." Rosie's breath hitched. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "When Mrs. Talbot said you only pitied me, it felt true, like everything I feared about myself." "Listen to me," Boaz said, his voice rough with emotion. "What I feel for you ain't pity. It's respect, admiration." He paused, gathering courage. "Love." The word hung in the air between them. honest and unadorned. Rosie's eyes widened, fresh tears spilling over. "Love?" she whispered. "Love," he confirmed simply. "The kind that sees all of you and wants to keep seeing more." Rosie's free hand reached up, touching his weathered cheek. "I love you too," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Not because you saved me, but because you saw me. Really saw me." They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and rain drummed overhead. Their joined hands rested between them, neither feeling the need to let go. Through the next day, they talked more than they ever had before, about fears and dreams, about the life they wanted to build together. When the storm finally cleared on the third morning, sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows. They stepped outside into a world washed clean, the air crisp and new. Their horses waited patiently in the lean-to, ready for the journey back. As Boaz helped Rosie mount, she didn't flinch or pull away. Her hands were steady on the reins, her smile sure and bright. They rode side by side down the mountain, no longer two lonely souls, but two hearts bound by choice and understanding. The town of Bitter Creek came into view as afternoon shadows lengthened. Rosie sat straight in her saddle, head held high. Boaz rode beside her, protective but not hovering, trusting in her strength. They were ready to face whatever came next. Together. Morning sunlight filtered through the chapel windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor. Inside, Reverend Reuben stood with Boaz and Rosie before the simple altar, his weathered Bible open in his hands. "The Lord's blessing be upon you both," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've shown us all what true love looks like, not perfect but persistent, not easy but enduring." Rosie dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while Boaz squeezed her hand. The morning blessing was private, intimate, just the three of them in the quiet chapel before the ceremony. Outside, Bitter Creek was stirring to life. The spring air carried the sweet scent of dogwood blossoms, and birds sang in the chapel eaves. Townspeople moved with purpose, carrying chairs and flowers, setting up for the afternoon wedding. Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, approached Boaz as he checked on the wedding preparations. "Got something for you," he said gruffly, pressing a small package wrapped in cloth into Boaz's hand. Inside lay a silver ring, simple but beautifully crafted with tiny pine needles etched around the band. "Can't take this," Boaz started, but Wheeler cut him off. "You can and you will, been saving that silver for something special." He clapped Boaz on the shoulder. "This is special." The baker's wife, Sarah Miller, arrived at the mission house where Rosie was getting ready, carrying a basket of fresh honey rolls still warm from the oven. "Wedding breakfast," she announced, setting them down. "Every bride needs something sweet on her special day." Throughout the morning, more townspeople stopped by with small gifts and kind words. The general store owner contributed ribbons for Rosie's hair. The school teacher brought pressed wildflowers. Even the magistrate passing by on his morning walk tipped his hat and offered a dignified nod of approval. Nora Talbot was nowhere to be seen, but her absence felt like a blessing rather than a shadow. The town had made its choice, choosing love over judgment, acceptance over fear. By noon, the space behind the chapel had transformed. Wooden chairs lined a natural aisle between blooming dogwood trees. White petals carpeted the ground, scattered by nature itself. Children had woven wildflower garlands to hang between the trees. Boaz stood at the end of the aisle wearing his best shirt, cleaned and pressed by the preacher's wife. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. Reuben stood beside him, Bible ready, offering quiet reassurance. The small crowd settled into their seats as the sun reached its peak. Someone began playing a hymn on a borrowed piano, the notes drifting through the chapel's open windows. Then Rosie appeared in the chapel doorway. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, borrowed from the preacher's daughter and carefully altered. Wildflowers and ribbons adorned her hair, which fell in soft waves past her shoulders. In her hands, she carried a small bouquet of prairie flowers. But it was her face that caught everyone's breath, radiant with joy, clear-eyed and certain. With steady determination, she began her walk down the petal-strewn path. Her crutch, polished and decorated with a ribbon, helped her keep her balance. She moved slowly but purposefully, head held high. Each step was a testament to her strength, each moment a declaration of her worth. Boaz watched her approach, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't bother wiping them away. This was a moment for honest emotion. When Rosie reached his side, she handed her crutch to the preacher's wife and turned to face Boaz. Their eyes met and held, speaking volumes without words. Reuben began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. He spoke of love's power to heal, of how two souls could find each other across any distance, of how God's grace worked through human hearts. When the time came for their vows, Rosie spoke first. Her voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to the last row of seats. "I do, Boaz." 3 simple words that held a world of meaning. Boaz's own "I do" was rougher, choked with emotion, but just as sincere. As Reuben pronounced them husband and wife, Boaz gently cupped Rosie's face in his hands and kissed her. The touch was tender, reverent, full of promise. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Several women dabbed at their eyes, and more than a few men looked away to hide their own tears. Rose petals showered down around them, thrown by laughing children. The piano struck up a joyful tune. Boaz and Rosie turned to face their community, no longer outsiders, but a family witnessed and blessed by all. Summer settled over the Elk River highlands like a warm blanket. Golden morning light spilled across the cabin's newly built wooden ramp, its smooth planks a testament to Boaz's careful craftsmanship. He'd spent 3 days measuring, cutting, and securing each board, making sure the slope was gentle enough for Rosie to navigate easily with her crutch. "What do you think?" he'd asked when it was finished, watching as she tested it for the first time. Rosie's smile had been answer enough, but she'd spoken anyway, her voice soft yet clear. "It's perfect, Boaz. Just perfect." The old stage house sat a quarter-mile from their cabin, a sturdy building that had once served as a way station for mail coaches. Now, thanks to Rosie's vision and Boaz's work, it had found new purpose. Fresh whitewash brightened its walls and cheerful curtains hung in the windows. Inside, low tables and chairs accommodated children who struggled with traditional schoolhouse seating. 3 times a week, Rosie welcomed her students, 5 children from nearby homesteads who, like her, faced challenges that kept them from regular schooling. There was Tommy with his twisted leg, Sarah who couldn't hear, 8-year-old James whose hands shook too much to hold a regular pen, and the Wilson twins who spoke with great difficulty. Preacher Reuben's wife Martha often assisted, her gentle patience a perfect complement to Rosie's innovative teaching methods. They used slate boards and thick pencils for those who struggled with fine movement. For Sarah, they developed a system of hand signals. Tommy had a special chair that supported his leg comfortably. "Every child deserves to learn," Rosie had written in her first letter to the school board. "And every child can learn if we only take the time to understand how." The timber earnings from Boaz's expanded logging operation helped fund the school's needs. He'd hired 2 men to help with the cutting and hauling, allowing him to increase production while still having time to support Rosie's work. Each morning he made sure the school's stove was lit and water barrel full before heading to the timber stand. Word spread quickly through the territory. Letters began arriving from parents in neighboring towns, asking about Rosie's teaching methods. Some wanted to send their children, others sought advice for teaching their own. Each evening, Rosie would sit at their kitchen table, carefully composing responses by lamplight while Boaz whittled nearby. "Listen to this," she'd say, reading aloud from a particularly moving letter. Her voice, though never loud, carried strength and purpose now. The frightened, silent girl from the auction yard was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth and her calling. Boaz would pause in his work, watching her lips form the words, still amazed sometimes by the simple miracle of her voice. He treasured every word, storing them away like precious gems. When she read, he heard not just the words but the passion behind them, the deep well of empathy that made her such a gifted teacher. Their evenings always ended the same way. As twilight deepened into night, they would sit together on the porch, their wooden chairs close enough for their hands to meet. Sometimes they talked about the day, a student's breakthrough, a new teaching idea, plans for the school's future. Other times they simply sat in comfortable silence, counting stars as they appeared one by one in the darkening sky. "That one there," Boaz would say, pointing to a particularly bright star. "That's the North Star. The Lakota call it Wichapi Owangila, the star that never moves." Rosie would squeeze his hand, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. Like that constant star, they had found their fixed point in each other. In this life they were building together. The school grew steadily through the summer months. Martha helped Rosie develop a proper curriculum, while Boaz expanded the stage house to accommodate more students. What had started as a small class of 5 now served 8 children regularly, with plans to accept more in the coming months. Each success, each small victory added another note to Rosie's voice. She spoke more frequently now, sharing stories with her students, discussing plans with Martha, calling out to Boaz across the yard. Her words came easily, naturally, though she never lost her thoughtful way of speaking, as if each word were a gift to be given carefully. At night, their joined hands resting on the porch rail, they would often sit in peaceful silence, listening to the evening sounds of their mountain home. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, an owl called from the forest edge, and sometimes in the distance a coyote's song echoed through the hills. These were the moments when both felt most blessed, not just by each other, but by the purpose they'd found together. Snow dusted the chapel's wooden steps as families filed in for Christmas service. Lantern light spilled through frosted windows, casting warm squares of gold onto the fresh powder outside. Inside, evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorated the walls, and dozens of glass lanterns hung from iron hooks, their flames dancing like earthbound stars. Boaz helped Rosie up the steps, his strong hand steady beneath her elbow. She clutched her Bible close, its pages marked with a red ribbon. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes shone with determination. They found their usual pew near the front, where Rosie could manage more easily with her crutch. Children from her school waved from nearby benches, their faces bright with recognition. Tommy, supported by his father, gave an enthusiastic wave. Sarah signed a greeting from her mother's lap. The Wilson twins whispered, "Merry Christmas," in their halting way. Each child's presence was a testament to how far they'd all come together. Reuben stood at the pulpit, his kind face glowing in the lantern light. "Tonight," he announced, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we are blessed to have Rosie Maddox read from the Gospel of Luke." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the congregation. Many remembered the mute girl from the auction yard, but few outside her school had heard her voice in public. Boaz squeezed her hand as she rose carefully from the pew. Rosie made her way to the pulpit, her crutch tapping softly on the wooden floor. The Bible lay open before her, its pages illuminated by candlelight. She took a deep breath and then began. "And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field." Her voice quavered at first, barely louder than a whisper, but as she continued, it grew stronger, carrying the ancient words with clear reverence. "Keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them." Boaz watched from his pew, pride swelling in his chest like a warm flame. He saw not just his wife reading scripture, but all the small victories that had led to this moment. Every painful practice session, every triumph over fear, every step toward healing. His vision blurred with unshed tears. The children from her school sat transfixed, their faces upturned like flowers toward the sun. They knew this voice, the one that encouraged them daily, that never gave up on them. Now they watched their teacher stand before the whole congregation, proving by example that limitations need not define a person's worth. "For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord." Rosie's voice had found its strength now, flowing smooth and clear as creek water. The familiar words seemed to take on new meaning through her telling, weighted with understanding of what it meant to be found, to be saved, to be made new. When she finished, the chapel fell silent for a moment before erupting in warm applause. Rosie made her way back to Boaz's side, her cheeks pink but her eyes shining with quiet joy. He took her hand and held it tight through the rest of the service. Afterward, as the congregation began to disperse into the snowy night, Reuben approached them near the door. His eyes were warm with emotion as he looked at Boaz. "You bought freedom for two people that day," he said softly, referring to the long-ago auction that had brought Rosie and Boaz together. Boaz shook his head, glancing at his wife with tender pride. "She paid it back tenfold," he replied, with one word. They both knew he meant that first whispered "Bo" behind the chapel, the moment that had changed everything. The ride home was peaceful, their horses' hooves making soft prints in the fresh snow. Rosie sat close to Boaz in the wagon, humming a Christmas hymn under her breath. Her voice, warmed by love and confidence, carried clear in the still night air. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. Through the trees they caught glimpses of their cabin. Lamplight glowed in its windows, a beacon in the darkness. The sight never failed to move them both. This home they'd built together, this life they'd chosen. The light seemed to shine like a star in the cold December night, guiding them home to where they belonged. As they drew closer, the cabin's warmth beckoned. Their Christmas tree waited inside, decorated with paper stars the children had made at school. 2 stockings hung by the hearth, and holly branches adorned the mantel. But the real gift wasn't in any package or decoration. It was in the miracle of finding each other, in the power of love to heal and transform, in the simple joy of being home together on this holy night. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.